Good day, everyone, or the few of you who have decided to turn up for this very interesting subject on data protection with rights management service. Welcome, and thank you for attending this session. Of all the other things you could have done today with your time, I'm very pleased that you decided to come here. And you are the guys who get to know all the new exciting stuff and can show off to the other guys who decided not to come to this session, who wanted to play video games or something. My name is Morgan Simonsen, and I'm going to be talking about the subject that you see on the screen, that is cloud-based rights management with Azure Rights Management Service. And just very quickly, I'd like to introduce myself. I work at a company called Lumagate. We specialized in cloud computing, any kind of cloud, private, public, government, any kind you like. Any cloud, any business, that's kind of our slogan. I'm coming up on 20 years now working with Microsoft technology. Started out with Active Directory back in Windows 2000. And a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, I made the switch to almost only working with cloud computing. So my previous experience helps me a lot now when I try to figure out how we move services and data into Azure. The guy with me in the picture is Scott Guthrie, whom you may know as the Corporate Vice President of Azure. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. If you have questions for me in private later on, I'll be down at booth 22 or right here down at the stage. We have a pretty short window between sessions, so I can't answer. I have to get out of here for the next speaker, and then I can field some questions. But feel free to ask questions throughout the session as well. I don't have any prizes, but I can offer you a hug. All right, so this is what I'm going to be talking about today. Kind of a busy schedule. I hope I get through everything. The problem here is that there is so much stuff that you want to share that sometimes you go a little overboard, but I'll try to keep on schedule. So obviously we have to figure out what is RMS, what is it doing, and why do we want it? So those will be the first things, and not least, how does it actually work? And as some of you may know, Microsoft has had this service for several years, rights management services. And how does this compare to what they had before, and how do we, if we have invested in that already, how can we start using this instead? And I also like to show you how we protect and consume our content, how we integrate this with online services and on-premises services. And I hopefully have a lot of demos to show you throughout. And we'll end up with a little troubleshooting. Hardly anything goes wrong in the cloud, but there might be 1 or 2 issues. All right, so I'll be showing you some demos in an environment throughout this session. And this is a fictional company that we have created just to have, instead of just using Contoso. I love Contoso. They run all the Microsoft products, but we want kind of our own thing. So we created this fictional company called Longsheep that creates Viking raiding ships. And we sort of use that as the case in all our demos in the company. So if you're wondering what that domain is, that's what it is. And I'll be sharing data between this company and my real live Lumagate account and vice versa. So why rights management, right? I remember when Apple decided to use DRM, which is the same thing as rights management services, on their iTunes files. How many like that feature? Right? Everybody hated it, right? Because it meant that Apple had control of our files wherever they were, and we were graciously given the right to play them if we pay them, etc. So that's kind of like the problem. But why do we need this? Because we have a lot of data in our company, and we have this idea today that the perimeter is fading, right? We have all these devices coming into our networks. Users are installing Dropbox and Box and OneDrive and all this stuff, and they start moving our files out of what we consider the safe part of our network, right? And when they leave our domain, they also leave our protection and our control. So the data is actually out there in the wild. We have no idea who has it, and it's no longer protected because our protection mechanisms aren't valid outside our own network. So this is really as much as a bring your own device or bring your own disaster scenario as anything else. We need to protect data when it's outside of our organization. So this is from a kind of an interesting study. 87% of senior management, no less, admitted to having copied company-sensitive documents into private devices or SkyDrives or whatever. So that's the problem right there, that the IT, the guy at the top, he doesn't really care. He just wants it to work. And also, almost 60% have accidentally lost data or sent it to the wrong person. Now, we all know that security is a carbon function, right? You cannot solve security with technology alone. But this, what we're talking about in this session, would certainly help, right? Because even though I were to send you something I shouldn't send you, you wouldn't be able to read it, no matter where it was. And we also have a tendency to focus on the personal devices. You know, this phone connecting to my mail server, that's the real problem. Whereas we might not have sufficient control and you know, information about our corporate devices, which present pretty much the same risk, right? So these are kind of like the challenges we're trying to address with rights management. So the first thing we need to figure out is what part of my data is actually worth protecting. You know, some document describing the company picnic might not be terribly important or dangerous if someone got a hold of, but projects, you know, financial statements, things like that, they're important. So the first thing we have to do is classify data. We have to figure out, okay, what's this data sitting over here, what's this over here? And this is the very first problem we have when deploying RMS. No one knows what's worth protecting, right? It's just a huge file server. Yeah, there's some stuff on there that I'd like to, you know, get control over. So that's the first thing. You have to figure out what do I need to protect, and how do I actually protect those things once they're out of my network or my control? And also, after they left, how can I actually figure out who is using them? And can I revoke access? You might be sending something to someone because they're going to do work on it for a limited amount of time. But after that, you might say, hey, I want the data back. I don't want you to have it anymore. This is also something we can address with rights management. And also, if you have government requirements, how can you honor those? While at the same time offering your users a flexible and mobile way to work with their data, right? So the solution for this, no surprise, is Azure Rights Management. And this is protection that never leaves the data. It protects your data wherever it is because the protection is an integral part of the data itself. They cannot be separated except by someone who owns the data in the first place, right? So that's the first nugget of information right there. The protection itself is inseparable from the data. Now, with RMS, we can protect unstructured data. This is not protection for web server data, right? I mean websites, you know, portals, things like that. It's not protection for SQL. It's protection for unstructured binary data that lives in a SharePoint library. It's an email or it's a file, right? Those are the kinds of things we protect with RMS. And RMS offers a complete solution to protect all those things very easily. And I'll show you how to enable that later on. It's already tightly integrated into Office 365, Windows Server, and a lot of third-party applications already are starting to support RMS. Because I'll show you as we go along why we need the application developers to help us make this ecosystem work. And it's built on standard technology. We use a PKI, Advanced Encryption Standard, and OAuth, and stuff like that. There's no proprietary stuff in here to encrypt and protect the content. So how many of you actually have deployed RMS in your own environments? Anyone? Okay. Was that a fun experience? Was it easy to share documents with someone outside your organization? Because that's the real problem here. I only saw 2 hands. But Microsoft actually did this over 10 years ago. They introduced rights management. It was available as Windows Rights Management Services in Windows Server 2003. And some years later came Active Directory Rights Management Services. And finally, now we have the cloud alternative, which is Azure Rights Management Service, which is a cloud service and not something you install locally at all. It is only consumed through the cloud, right? So that's also something to be aware of, that if you want to use this service, there has to be some connection to the internet, right? In some way. We can limit that very much, but there has to be some interaction with the cloud for this to work. Okay, so that's the evolution right there. We won't be spending any time on the previous two versions. We'll only be talking about the Azure one. Okay, but before we dive into the technology, we need to figure out some terminology here, because the thing to know about RMS that when you protect something, it is always encrypted. Even though you protect it, giving everyone in your organization complete full access to the data, it is still encrypted, right? There is no such thing as RMS protection without encryption. So were you to lose your keys that encrypted the data, it's absolutely gone. But just remember that. So we have two kinds of encryption that we're using here. We have symmetric encryption, which means that it's the same key that encrypts data that also can convert it back into plain text, right? And we're using something called asymmetric encryption, where there are two different keys, one to protect the content and one to decrypt it again. Both of those are in use in RMS, right? We have a private-public key pair, which are the keys that are used when you do asymmetric encryption. I want to share something with you. I find your public key, which is exactly that. It's a public key that everyone can know. I encrypt the data with that. You, having the private key, is the only one who can decipher it and read it, right? This is regular PKI. Now, signing, that means attesting something using your private key. And we use signing a lot in RMS, right? Because we have to verify that this content or this protection or this license actually came from someone you can identify. And signing always happens using your private key. Encryption happens using the public key, but signing is with the private key. And finally, a license is sort of like a document specifying what can you do with this product. Now that's what licenses have been doing all along. We just never bothered to read them, right? Because the end-use license agreement that came with Windows, the one we hit accept on in like half a second, that actually told us what we could use this product for and how, right? It's the exact same thing here. A license in RMS terms means this is your list of things you can do with this data. Okay. So, no surprise, certificates are at the core of RMS. Certificates control everything. But they're not the regular kind of certificates we're used to using, right? When we install a certificate on our web server, we use something called X509 certificates. RMS uses a totally different kind. They're not even stored in the same place. So I'll try to show you how they're different as we go along. Now, Azure RMS, it's implemented as a web service in the Azure cloud. You do almost no configuring of the service itself. You only interact with it and tell Azure that, hey, I want to use you to do this and that. It's available in 5 different regions, and they all work the same. And the only reason we select a region is for performance considerations, right? It makes no sense for us to use the RMS endpoint in Asia. We want to use the one here in the European Union. And it offers 3 distinct services. And this is true for all RMS implementations, by the way. It does certification. It means, okay, I have asserted that you are who you say you are, and I'm going to give you a certificate signed by me attesting that, yes, I know that this is Morgan. That's the first thing it does. Second is licensing. It says, okay, here you are, you want to use this content, here is a license for that content. And finally, it does publishing. The first time I want to protect something, I have to create a list of rules, right? Who am I going to allow to use this data, and in what way? Then I publish something, a license attached to that data. That is publishing. That is also the work of the RMS server. So certification, establishing identity, licensing, issuing use licenses for stuff. Publishing is protecting content. Now, this is one of the most ingenious things about RMS, is that it actually is using Azure Active Directory for authentication. That very first piece of authentication between you and the service, that used to be integrated Windows authentication in your own network. Now it is authentication against Azure Active Directory, which is itself a cloud service available for everyone to use. And we'll come back to why that is really smart thing to do. Now, as I said, in RMS, every entity that interacts with the system is represented by a certificate in some way. Everything is. My identity, my licenses, my rights to use something, my protection of something, they're all certificates. And they use something called the Extensible Rights Markup Language, which means these are plain text certificates that we can open with Notepad and have a look at, right? Every key in RMS on your local computer is protected by the Data Protection API. That's how we secure the keys for these certificates, because it seems counterintuitive, right, to have someone be able to read the certificate with a notepad, but the actual private keys, they're not in there. They're protected and stored somewhere else. And all these certificates are connected in a hierarchy, starting with the Azure RMS service at the top, which we all trust, right, because we have decided to do that and use the service. So these are the certificates involved. And I think it's important to understand how this works, otherwise we have no idea how we're going to deploy it, and at least not troubleshoot it afterwards. So at the very top, we have something called the Server Licenser Certificate. This certificate is the certificate of the Azure RMS service itself, right? And it is not published in any, it's not certified by DigiCert or any of those official certification authorities. This is an internal certificate signed by Microsoft that we decide to trust. And every client who interacts with Azure RMS has a copy of this certificate's public key on the computer, because it needs that when it's going to protect content. So we all have a cached copy of this certificate, obviously only the public key. Next, we have something called the Security Processor Certificate. This identifies our device, right? Could be a phone, could be the computer, anything else that is rights management compliant. That is the device. Now, the reason the device needs a certificate is that the device is integral in actually being able to protect the content, right? It makes no sense to have a hacked computer be able to do RMS protection, because it's the computer's job to actually do the protection and the encryption. So we need to have something that locks down and secures the RMS subsystem on each device. And this certificate identifies that subsystem. And you have one of these for every device, right, that you interact with. Next is the Rights Account Certificate. Now, this identifies me as a user. And there are only one rack. The RMS server, the very first time tell it I want to use RMS, it's going to create a rack for me, and it's going to store it in its own database as an encrypted blob. Now, every time I authenticate somewhere, and then I mean authentication via Azure Active Directory, it's going to hand me down that rack certificate unless I already have it on that device. So that means for me to start using RMS on this phone, if I've been using it on this computer, all I have to do is log into RMS, and it's going to give me the rack. And it's going to store it in the lockbox and secure it with the processor certificate, right? Because I need that certificate, that's the only certificate that can unlock all the data I have either protected or that I have been given licenses for. So the rack is your own personal certificate. If some of you have heard the name GIC, that is also just another name for the rack. Next, we have something called the Client Licenser Certificate. Now, you have one of these per device, and you might actually have several per device as well. This is a certificate you use when you want to publish something. Okay, you decide that I want to protect this email or this file and share it with someone. You ask the server, may I please have a licenser certificate so I can sign data? And the server generates that and sends it to me, signs it with my rack public key, right? So I'm the only one who can decrypt it, because now I'm uniquely identified as the source and the protector of this document, right? So if I give it to you, it'll say, hey, Morgan shared this document with you. You have the following permissions. Now, the way it identifies me is by this client licenser certificate. So I need that to be able to protect data and share it with someone. So the very first time I do that, I get a CLC. And with the CLC, I create the publishing licenses. The actual protection or the policy that is attached to the data, which I send to you, right? That's the publishing license. And it's also signed in all sorts of different ways by my certificate and the server certificates, etc. And finally, if I want to consume data protected by someone else, I need a use license. So whenever someone sends me a protected file, I have a look at it and I see, okay, this is protected by that guy and he's using this service. I contact that service, provide my own rack. May I please have a use license for this content? So you will have one use license for each piece of content that someone has shared with you. So as you can see, there are a lot of certificates involved here. Haven't fallen asleep yet? Okay. All right. So Azure AD as the trust fabric. Now, Azure AD is Microsoft's next directory service, right? We've been using Windows Server Active Directory for, I don't know, what is it now? 15 years, 16 years maybe. And this is the next version, right? And it does a lot of the same things that Active Directory does, only it's a multi-tenant, globally distributed directory service. And it doesn't cost anything to run Azure AD. You get it for free by Microsoft, unless you have more than 500,000 users, then they're going to start charging you. I don't think that will be a problem for any of us in here. And now if we integrate our own identities with Azure AD, we now have a globally available directories and authentication service, right? So we can, wherever we are, we can authenticate against something and be issued, a token based on that authentication. So what we do is that the bottom triangles there, they're on-premises ADs, right? They're the directory services we run today. And the problem with those is that they're only valid inside our own networks. So the first thing we do is we create a tenant in Azure AD. And you can sort of loosely think about Azure AD as one huge Active Directory forest where we all are given our own subdomains. But that is just, that's not how it works. But just think about it in that way, right? We have a global namespace. It's called onmicrosoft.com. And under that namespace, we are all given tenant names, which are, comparable to subdomains. So I get one of those tenants. It's free. And I integrate my existing Active Directory with it. That means I do a one-way synchronization of all my users and groups into Azure AD. So that means that a user with one account and one password can log on to something at home and access services there, or he can go into the cloud and log on to Azure AD with the same username and password and access services there. From the user's perspective, it's only one user, whereas in reality it's two. So he won't know the difference because we make sure that he has the same username and password both at home and in the cloud. And we can also take it one step further. What John was talking about in the previous session, we can integrate this with ADFS, where we have single sign-on in some scenarios. But we decide to establish what we call a hybrid identity model, right? We synchronize our directory with Azure AD, and it's available for us to use for any cloud purpose. And that's really what's happening in Azure RMS. Because instead of using the local Windows Server directory, which is only valid for our users, right, and on our network, we're using Azure AD to establish that very first identity, which gives us the rack certificate. And that's the genius here, because as long as we have an Azure AD account, we can establish our identity against Azure RMS, which is just a service using Azure AD for authentication, just like Office 365 or Intune is, right? It's an identity provider. So RMS is just one of the many systems that's using it. That means that we have an implicit trust with everyone else that is using Azure AD, right? Because we're all in the same forest. So we have all decided to trust Azure AD. So I can authenticate, and I can use the token that Azure AD is giving me and present to you who have also decided to trust Azure AD and say, hey, we have a common source of trust here. I can authenticate, and you can trust that I am who I say I am. This is the genius here, because previously, when you wanted to interact between two RMS instances, you had to decide to trust each other, right? You had to exchange keys, maybe you even had to have a forest trust, all those exciting things that broke easily. So now we don't have to do it because we have a trust fabric in the cloud available for everyone for free who wants to use it. And we don't even have to sign up as an org. The users can do this implicitly, which I'll show you later. So this is like the first stroke that makes this technology really usable for everyone. As long as you have Azure AD, you're ready to go. So, like I said, that first piece of authentication, that's what's giving you the rack and lets you publish content or consume content. So there are two more concepts that we need to explore here. The first one is something called the trusted user domain. Now, this is a term that implies that a licensing server can accept end-user license requests made by a trusted organization tenants, right? So Azure Azure RMS has decided that, hey, I'm going to trust Azure AD. Whichever tenant you're coming from, I'm going to trust you. So I'm going to treat all the tenants in Azure AD as trusted user domains. That means I am willing to issue licenses for content from those organizations. And the other one is trusted partner domain. And this lets RMS publish licenses for content it does not own itself, right? Because we don't have our own RMS anymore, we have a shared one. So we have to configure that as, hey, I'm going to let you publish licenses for my content. I'm not going to use my own RMS service anymore, I'm going to use you. So that's a trusted partner domain. Now, all our tenants, we trust Azure RMS as a trusted partner domain. Now, the reason I bring this up, as you'll see later in the commands, when we actually enable this stuff, that terminology is in use. Okay, so how do we actually protect something? How does it work? So try to remember all those certificates we had, right? So we start out on the left-hand side with the secret cola formula, right? This is a clear text, unprotected document. Can be anything, as long as it's a file, right? And we start off by generating this symmetric encryption key, which is a strong key generated in the computer, and we encrypt the file with that key. And the reason we are using symmetric encryption, it's twofold. The first one is that symmetric encryption is a lot faster than asymmetric encryption. It takes a lot of time to use asymmetric encryption to encrypt something. So symmetric is a lot faster. And we also need to be able to share this content, right? So we can't just keep continually encrypting another copy of this content with someone else's public key all the time. The file, the data would grow to enormous proportions. So we need to have one key that can open this content that several has access to. And that's what happens next, right? Because the RMS subsystem on the client, he encrypts this symmetric key first with the server's key, right? Remember, the client has a copy of the server licensor certificate. So I'm going to encrypt this key, the symmetric key, with your public key. That means that the server will always be able to unlock the symmetric key, unlock the content, and give a license to someone else, right? Next thing it does is it encrypts the symmetric key with its own key, because every time you protect something with RMS, you're granting yourself owner privileges over it, right? So you always have access. You can't turn that off. That's implicit. Next, the client decides on, okay, who am I going to share this with, and what kind of rights am I going to give them? And this is sort of like comparable to an ACL, right? An access control list. John has this kind of rights, Peter has this, this group has that, etc. Right? You put that in something called the publishing license, you send that to the server signs it, it all gets signed a couple of more times by different certificates, it comes back to you and you attach it to the file and send it to whoever wants it. Now, the important thing here is that the data of the file, your data, is never ever sent to Azure RMS. The data never leaves your client. All of this happens there. The only thing that gets sent to the cloud is the policy or the publishing license, right? Because we need the server to be able to sign that, and we need the server to store its own copy of the symmetric key for this content. But our data never leaves the network. It only happens on our computer. Now, I give this file to someone, right? And he wants to open it. Attached to the file is a clear text publishing license. He can open that, and he can have a look at it, and says, okay, you, my friend, can go here to get a license for this file. So I contact whichever endpoint is entered in that publishing license. It'll be Azure RMS in this case. I present my rack, which uniquely identifies me, right? The server is trusting that because we're all in trusted user domains. So it says, okay, I trust that you are who you say you are. Do you have permissions? Let me have a look in the publishing license. Yes, you do. And if that is the case, it'll generate another copy of the symmetric encryption key encrypted with my rack's public key and do some signing, and it'll send that back to me. So since I am the only one having that rack, I can now decrypt the symmetric key, decrypt the content, and use it with the rights given to me. Now, this last bit is very important because what is to, stop me from actually violating the license that is given to me? So the server says, okay, here is a license. You only have read access. So how do I stop the subsystem, right, from just giving me full access to this file? And that's where this server processor certificate comes in, right? Because that is only issued to a subsystem that RMS actually trusts. Because the thing that honors these rights, it's the RMS subsystem on the computer. There is no way for the server to enforce the right? And on a file server, the server can do that. You can come with your identity and say, give me that file, I want to change it. No, you don't have access. In this case, the server can't do that. So we're dependent on a local part of the system to actually enforce the trust for us. So instead of just talking, let's do some actual protection. So I'll log on to one of the computers that I have in this demo environment, and I'll very quickly go into documents, and we'll create an empty text file, right? And we call that NIC secrets. So it's 0 bytes. And I'm going to do like this, protect in place. I'm going to select a template. I'll get back to templates later. These are just pre-canned, ways to protect stuff. I'm going to protect it with my company's internal rights. So now all this signing stuff is going on, right? Certificates are going back and forth. And even though if I were offline, I could still protect this content. Because remember, I have a copy of the server's public key. I have a cached copy of the client licensor certificate. So I can protect content all I want on a local machine. Because when I send the file to someone, the publishing license contains enough information for the server to issue that user an end-user license. So I can do this offline. So this file became something called a ptext file, which is a protected text file, and I'll come back to that. And if I have a look at this file in Notepad, you'll see that this file uses Microsoft Information Protection Solutions. Can you see this text? Is it too small? We won't do a whole lot of reading. We'll just figure it out. Have a look at a few of the properties. So first of all, it has this string localized in every language there is, right? Or not everyone there is, but a lot of them. Anyway. So this is really just to inform whatever system is trying to consume it that, hey, this is a protected file. You can't really read this without obtaining a license. So, and down here, this is really an XML certificate. Now, I'm going to try doing something here. We're going to replace this with, I think it's that one. Did that work? No, it didn't. Okay. Let's undo that, and let's do it right this time. Where are you? We need to do this. All right, let's see what we got now. So this is my pretty unfancy XML formatting in an attempt to show you what this actually does. Because here you see all the properties for use rights and authorities and GUIDs and stuff like that that actually identifies where can I go to obtain content. Now this is one of the RMS endpoints. It's from the European Region 1. RMS EU AADRM COM, right? These are the web services endpoints where the consumer of the file can go and get a license and stuff like that. So all that is clear text in the file. Now, since this file is 0 bytes, it won't actually have any data, but if we created a file that had some data in, we would see this as an encrypted blob in here somewhere, encrypted with this symmetric key, right? And the encryption is AES 256, so it's pretty good. So unless you're the NSA, you probably won't be able to read it. I think we've given the NSA a bad rap, you know? They're backing up all our stuff. Excellent. I call them. I had some holiday pictures back from 2005 that I'd lost. Restored them, no problem. They had everything. So this is the way the file looks when we protected it. So this file is perfectly safe for me to send to any one of you, and you won't be able to open it unless you have something that can understand RMS protection and an Azure AD account. All right. So how do we deploy this cool feature? Good news is you might already have it, because Azure RMS is included in Office 365 E3, E4, A3, and A4 plans. It's there. It's the full version of the service. And it's just a matter of you to actually enable it or not. You can purchase RMS as a separate license if you're interested in that. And it's also part of the Enterprise Mobility Suite, right? Enterprise Mobility Suite is really a licensing package where Microsoft says, hey, we're going to give you Azure AD Premium, Windows Intune, or Microsoft Intune, and RMS at a pretty discounted price. So those are the kind of like the 3 options you have. Now, to activate it for your subscription, rather to activate it for Office 365, you go into the portal, select Service Settings, Rights Management, Manage, and then activate it. Just press one button, and what that does, it establishes this trusted publishing domain, trusted user domain, trust relationship between your tenant and Azure AD. Sorry, Azure RMS. Another way is to go to the Azure portal, select your directory, go to Rights Management, and click Activate. Exactly the same thing happens. And finally, you can use PowerShell, because Azure RMS is fully PowerShell configurable. And the command that you use is enable AADRM. Now, you notice that there are a lot of different acronyms in use here. We have RMS, we have RM, we have IP. It's all the same thing, right? So never mind that they're using different TBFs. So what about these templates that I briefly showed you? The templates, they defined preset levels of protection, right? And it's human-readable protection. It's not enumerate directory subfolders or traverse folder subtree. They're not those kind of permissions, right? They're read, contribute, full control. They try to make these as humanly readable as possible. So the template says, okay, who has access? What kind of access do you have? And we can also scope these templates to only be available for a subset of our users. Because the main thing that people are doing wrong when they implement RMS is that, hey, we need to create templates for all sorts of different things. And that's the first mistake. I recommend that you keep the number of templates you have as small as humanly possible. I can use Microsoft as an example. They have only 5 templates in their internal RMS. They have something called organizational confidential. That means that if you are a user in the Microsoft Azure AD tenant, you can read this content. So it's for everyone, right? And we have the same version of that, only that it's read-only. Next is something called FTE confidential, full-time employee confidential, right? So everyone that is a blue badge at Microsoft, that means a full-time employee, you can read and change this content. So we have, we separate ourselves from all the partners and the vendors that might also be in there. And you also have the read-only version of that. And finally, you have do not forward, which we only use for email, right? You cannot forward this message to anyone. It's only meant for you. So those are the 5 they have. So keep the number of templates as low as you possibly can. And if you see the need for specialized templates for maybe R&D work and stuff like that, you can create a scope templates that only show up for the people who are actually supposed to use it, right? And I'll show you that too later. So this is an example. These are the default templates that everyone who activates RMS get. You have something called unrestricted access, and it's only available in Outlook, right? That means no protection. This file is not in any way touched by RMS. Do not forward, which is also only an email right that you can give. This email cannot be forwarded by you. And then you get something called tenant name, which is the name that you selected for your Azure AD tenant, right? In my case, it's Lumagate. In this example case, it's Longsheep, and Microsoft, it's Microsoft, right? So whatever you selected as your company name, in front of confidential and confidential view only. So these two permissions mean, confidential means, as long as you can authenticate as a user in this Azure AD tenant, I'm going to give you full rights to this document, right? So right there, you have sort of like a shell protection. If you use this as a default protection, you're guaranteed that only users in your directory can read it. So that's just a huge benefit right there, right? We don't have that kind of global protection today. You can just enable this template, put it in a policy. Everyone has to use it. Our information is instantly protected from everyone except us. The next one is the same thing, only it's view only. So this information is available to everyone in the company, but can only be viewed. Now remember, the owner always has permissions. If you want to create custom templates, you can do that in the Azure portal, in SharePoint libraries, or through PowerShell. And I'll show you how to do that. So this is a screenshot, and we'll have a look at it right now, for an extra template I have created for something called Project X that is running inside the demo company, right? It's a very secret project for a new jet propulsion Viking ship, and they need to keep that very secret. So I'll just quickly have a look in the portal, and I'll show you what that looks like. And to save ourselves time, we're going to do like this. I might have to do MFA sign-in now, but that's all right. And I didn't. Lucky me. So this is the Active Directory icon, right, for Azure AD. We go in here. We'll find this is our directory. This is the right management tab here where we control RMS settings. And it's a really simple interface. The only thing we actually have is templates. And here I can see, oops, almost no money left. These are my default templates. I should probably leave those alone. I can change the names and stuff like that. And these are my custom templates. So let's go ahead and create another template. Now I have to select a language, right? A primary language for how the name of this template is going to be presented. And we'll call this one NIC content. So I'll only share it with you. Haha. Will rights protect everything from this session and not give it to anyone except you guys who were here? Perfect. Okay. Here it is. And it has 3 settings. Configure rights for users and groups, publish, and additional. So this is what we want to have a look at. Specify which users and groups this is going to apply to, right? So here you say, who can read the content protected with this template? Good idea here to select a group, right? So I would typically, in this case, create a NIC group. I would apply this template to that group. So that means that anyone using this template to protect content would only make it readable to members of that group. I, as the owner, would of course have complete access. Now for groups to show up here, they have to be mail enabled. And I don't have a NIC conf group that's mail enabled. I won't spend time creating one in Office 365, etc. But this is the way you do it. So instead of doing that, we can look at this one, which is already pre-configured. Now here you see this group is given co-author. That means that they can change the content much as they like. And I've also scoped this template so it's only available to the members of the same group, right? Because it makes no sense to have someone else who is not a part of Project X to protect something that is only readable by Project X, right? That's not a good idea. So I've scoped this template to only be available to them. And finally, we have this status, which says either published or archive. Archive means that this is either a template I'm not using anymore or a new one I am developing for future use. And publish means that it's available for the organization to use to protect content. You should never ever delete templates. More on that later. Okay. Go away. There we go. This is the, if you want to use RMS for Exchange Online, you have to do it with PowerShell. Stay there. These are the three okay. These are the three commandlets that you need to use. You first have to establish a regular PowerShell session against your Exchange Online instance. I guess you all done that a lot of times. Next is you have to do something called set IRM configuration, RMS online key sharing location, and here you give the location of the RMS endpoint that you want to use, right? This is the one from North America because it says NAAADRM. You probably want to use the one here. And then you do import RMS trusted publishing domain, right? The thing we were talking about earlier, where you say that, hey, I'm going to use RMS online as my trusted publishing domain. And then finally, internal licensing enabled is true. Once you do that, your Outlook clients will start pulling down the templates that you have defined, and they can protect the content. And I'll very quickly show you that in Outlook on this client. So this is an email for some of you, and here are the permissions I can set. So you see, since this is email, I have unrestricted access and do not forward. If I hadn't run those commandlets, this wouldn't show up. Simple as that. All right. You can also set policies in Exchange. These are called data loss prevention policies, right? Data loss means that I want to control my information. You can do that in Exchange Online. You can say any document that through filtering or searching matches these criteria is going to be protected with this template. So in this case, what you see on the screen, I've created a transport rule in Exchange that says anything that contains the word project space X is going to be encrypted with the same project X template, right? So if anyone inadvertently sends out a document to someone else, it'll be protected. Now, it might be totally valid that you're actually going to send this document to someone else who is a part of Project X, but he wants it on his Gmail account. That's perfectly valid. We don't have to be worried about those scenarios anymore because we know that the data is protected. Now, wherever he is on his aunt's computer in Brazil with his Gmail account, as long as he can authenticate to Azure AD, prove his identity, he'll get the rack, and he can decrypt the content. Same thing with SharePoint. SharePoint libraries can have policies attached to them, whereas anything in this library will be protected with template X. Same thing here, right? Working on this project, you save files in this library. The minute someone downloads something from that library, it'll be protected. Now, for SharePoint Online, you have to first enable it for your tenant. This is done at the SharePoint Online level. And then you enable it for your libraries. So this is the last screenshot there is a typical new policy RMS template for SharePoint libraries. So you set who is going to read, etc., etc. Are they going to print it? Basically, you set the permissions. So what if you actually want to save something with someone who isn't using RMS at all, right? Either internally or through Azure RMS. Microsoft has decided that in order for this to be adopted, we need to help that try to fix that problem. So they launched this thing called RMS for individuals. And this is like the second golden nugget in this system that makes this usable for everyone. Because they are offering us for free an RMS license for consumption of protected content. So that means that as long as you have an Azure AD account, and you can get that for free as well, I'll get to that, I can share content with you and protect it. And you can use your own email address. So you go to this URL called portal.aadrm.com. You enter your email address, whatever it is, could be your own private domain, could be your company domain, doesn't really matter. You log on, they do some checks. Okay, is there an Azure AD tenant for this domain? No, then we'll create it. They actually on demand create an Azure AD tenant for your domain. That's called a viral tenant, right? And they put your user in there, you set a password, and voila, you're ready to go. You can consume the content I sent you, protected. If there already is a tenant, it'll check and see, okay, is it allowed for this user to ad hoc request RMS usage? If the case is yes, fine, then the same thing will happen. You'll be created a user and can start using RMS. Now, if the administrator of your company has decided that, no, I don't want to let my users do that, he can, of course, block that. And I tried this with one of the Norwegian ISPs, Telenor, right? They have this online.no domain. That domain is enabled for this. So I have an RMS license, if you like, attached to that account. Now, some domains have been blocked. Gmail.com, Outlook.com, etc. have been blocked because those guys don't want viral tenants for their domain names to suddenly start popping up in Azure AD. So you won't be able to do this with one of those huge email accounts, but you probably can do it with almost anything else. There is a list at the RMS website with all the domains that are blocked. So this is really a hugely usable feature and makes this actually available for everyone. So next is application support, right? Like I said, we need the applications and file formats to understand what RMS is, right? And the applications that do that, we call them enlightened, right? They understand what this is. They can both consume and protect content. And these applications, they are that's running this lockbox, right? That enforces the rights that are granted in the publishing license. That's their job. So they have to be certified by Microsoft, and any flaws or bugs or willful circumvention of the licenses in that application will invalidate RMS protection, right? So a lot of time is spent to make sure that the enlightened applications actually honor the licenses. Now, if there is no application or file format support for what you're trying to do, it might be a CAD drawing, might be an exe file, whatever. You can use something called the RMS sharing app, which is another free application from Microsoft that can actually use RMS protection for any content, anything there is. And it looks like this. This is the GUI. It installs on your computer very quickly. It adds some buttons and shortcuts to your Explorer view. And it already supports Office file formats. So if you're using an old version of Office, like 2007, those applications aren't enlightened. So you can use this one instead to protect Office natively. It also has built-in support and viewer for a lot of the most common text and image files, right? So there's a pretty long list now at the RMS sharing website, where RMS sharing app understands what a JPEG is, understands what a text file and an XML file is, and can apply correct permission to it. That's what we did earlier, right, when we created that ptext file. Now, RMS sharing application, if it understands what the file is, hey, this is a text file, this is an image, it'll create a new file called P and then the existing extension. So text becomes ptext, JPEG becomes pJPEG, right? It's a protected JPEG. Now, if it doesn't know what the file is, it'll create something called a P file. And this is comparable to a zip archive with a password on it, right? Because I can put the data, whatever it is, in an RMS encrypted and protected container. And you have to authenticate to Azure AD with your rack to read that. But once it's open, you can do whatever you want with the data because the protection isn't in that data. It's just wrapped around it, right? So if you do that with Sharing App and you open this file, it says, hey, I can't control this data anymore, but you better do what I told you, right? This content was just for you, no one else. And this tool is also downloadable from the same portal where you sign up for RMS for individuals. So there are quite a few applications that understand RMS. Obviously, the Office suite is the most important one, and 2010, 2013, they both have enlightened support for this. Mac OS has, and RMS Sharing App, of course. Now, there is a server component here as well. All the server, or many of the Microsoft servers components, they're also RMS enlightened, right? Because Exchange needs to be in order to be able to protect a file I'm sending out, right? Okay, this is an email, it has an attachment. My policy tells me that this needs to be encrypted with this template. That means that Exchange itself needs to be RMS enlightened. And that's happening all over the place. Exchange, SharePoint, and Windows Server all have this built-in support to be able to, by policy, protect stuff. And also third-party things, they're coming along. We have Foxit and Adobe, and also a lot of other applications. Now, phone support is also pretty good. The RMS Sharing App is available for every major mobile platform. This is just an example of some of the guys who have started implementing RMS. Now, to administer this, it's really pretty simple. You saw the portal, right? You create the templates, you enable it for SharePoint Online and Exchange Online, you create data protection policies, perhaps, if that is what you want, and that's it. You actually have to do no administration of the service itself. You only administer how you use it. Now, there are 3 ways you can deploy this. You can do the cloud-ready way, which is what I'm doing in the demo, right? I have only Office 365, I have only Azure AD, I am maybe syncing my identities into Azure, but that's it. Everything is happening in the cloud. RMS is integrating directly with Office 365, etc. Now, if I don't want to go that far, I want to keep my SharePoint and Exchange server and file servers on premises. I can install something called the RMS connector, which works as a proxy. It lies and it tells local Active Directory that, hey, I am a bona fide Active Directory server RMS service. And all those server products believes it, and it proxies all the requests up to the RMS service. So this is really usable if you're in that situation. And finally, you're saying that, hey, man, I don't like this cloud thing at all. I want to use RMS. I want to take advantage of the trust fabric offered to me by Azure Active Directory. So I'm going to have to accept that I sync my identities into Azure AD, but that's the only thing I need to do. I run something, in this case, I run something called the RMS Hub, which is a new product. It's in preview now, I think, for Microsoft. It'll keep all the keys, all the management, and the complete box product on premises. But it's able to attach to Azure AD and share content with someone else, right, through this trust fabric. So this is the last deployment option there. Now, the last minute we'll spend on troubleshooting. The first thing to notice is that, hey, I created a new template. It doesn't show up. What happened? So there are policies that decide when templates gets refreshed and stuff like that. So the easiest thing to do is actually to protect the file, because that forces both Office and the RMS Sharing App to actually connect to the service and pull down the templates. So that might be the easiest choice. In Exchange, you actually have to do import trusted publishing domain again and do an update. It won't automatically pick those up. So that's kind of dumb right there, but I think that's going away pretty soon. And also, the thing that most often happen is that I get a call saying, hey, my templates, they're not showing up, man. It's been 2 weeks now. And I asked, is it published? Did you publish it? Ah, of course. I created it, I configured it, everything is okay, but I didn't actually press the publish button. So no one will see it. This error you might also encounter, very humanly readable right there, failed to acquire a license for a protected message for blah, 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 and some error code. this error code usually means that whatever template used to protect this content has since been deleted or archived. And the RMS service can't issue me a use license for something protected with a template that is no longer available to it. And this is also the reason you should never delete templates, because it'll actually render it impossible to get to that content. So never do that. Now, the owner, he can get to it, of course, but that's it. Same thing, if you get NDRs for transport rules in Exchange, that template has probably been deleted or archived. I won't go through this. I'll just left it in the presentation so you can have a look at that later. These are the most used registry and file paths where you can have a look at the templates and stuff like that. On my client, this is an example of this. So here you have, right, client licensor certificates, end use licenses. We have our templates. I have something called .drm. These are the lockbox certificates, right? Etc. So if you want to have a look at those and try to figure out what's going on, I'll just leave that in there. All right. Why can't PowerPoint just start where I left off? If you want more information, it's a good idea to follow the RMS blog. Stop. No. A lot of good content there. And there is also some pretty good stuff on the Azure documentation site. You can read this at your leisure. You'll get a copy of the presentation, right? So you don't have to write all this down. We're out of time, so I don't think questions, we won't have time for questions, but I'll be down at booth 22, I think. And please evaluate the session on your way out. If you didn't like it, give me a green one. If you think it was okay, give me a green one. And if you really liked it, give me a green one. Thank you very much.